In the final months of World War II, the Third Reich's absolute dominance began to crumble under the weight of defeat. For Nazi generals, men who had for years commanded armies with seemingly unshakable confidence, all they could do was watch as everything they had built fell. The Soviet invasion leveled entire cities. For civilians trapped in Berlin, the fall of the city was hell on earth. Entire families took refuge in dark basements as the thunder of bombing shook the walls. Welcome to the Soldier's Diary. The mass capture of Nazi generals. The arrival of the Russians in the city unleashed a wave of panic. Rumors of reprisals and violence spread like a terrifying echo, while in the streets, the German defenses gave way to the relentless advance of the Red Army. Buildings were set on fire, houses were demolished, and a trail of ruins was left behind. Some German soldiers, desperate, fought to protect their families, while others, aware of the inevitable, chose to surrender. Among high-ranking officers, the decisions were equally extreme. Some continued to resist, but others already considered surrender as the only possible way out. In this context, the USSR already controlled the Reichstag, whose capture on April 30th, 1945, with the iconic placement of the Soviet flag on its dome, represented a decisive propaganda coup and a symbolic act of what was the final victory after 4 long years of fighting. They also managed to dominate the Führerbunker, where Hitler committed suicide, and the government district, the strategic heart of Berlin. With these nerve centers in their hands, the Soviet generals sealed the fate of Germany. Meanwhile, the Nazis faced their final hour. Some ordered suicidal counterattacks, others burned documents or fled. One thing was clear: everything, overnight, turned into chaos. On the morning of May 2nd, 1945, as Berlin bled to death under the smoke of the final fighting, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the city's defense, formally surrendered to Soviet forces. His decision was not improvised. After confirming Hitler's death on April 30th in the Führerbunker, Weidling, his uniform torn and his face covered in soot after days holed up in the bunker of the Ministry of Aviation, had tried to negotiate a surrender since May 1st, but the Soviets, distrustful after months of Nazi deceptions such as Heinrich Himmler's false promises to negotiate a separate peace in April, or Felix Steiner's attempts to simulate a non-existent counterattack, demanded unconditional capitulation. Finally, escorted by Red Army soldiers, the German general was led to a half-ruined building in Tempelhof, where Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 8th Guards Army, was waiting for him. The scene, described in Soviet memoirs such as Chuikov's, was chaotic. Walls riddled with bullet holes, tables improvised from planks, and maps spread out under armed guard. According to official Red Army records, the exchange was brief and formal. Chuikov demanded the complete surrender of German troops in Berlin, and Weidling, his uniform covered in dust and his face haggard, signed an order for his army to lay down its arms. The document, broadcast hours later by loudspeakers in the streets, read, "On April 30th, 1945, the Führer committed suicide, abandoning all those who had sworn allegiance to him to their fate. Faithful to the Führer's order, you German soldiers have been ready to continue the battle for Berlin. Even though your ammunition was exhausted and given the general situation, it is now absurd to continue resisting. I order that all resistance cease immediately. Every hour of continued fighting prolongs the terrible suffering of the civilian population of Berlin and of our wounded. In agreement with the High Command of the Soviet troops, I order you to immediately cease the fight." The order to surrender, booming from loudspeakers torn by fighting, traveled through the streets like a final whisper. Amid the smoking rubble, thousands of German soldiers, teenage faces of the Hitler youth still trembling beneath oversized helmets, alongside Wehrmacht veterans in tattered uniforms and dull decorations, began to empty their weapons. Some did so with martial rigidity, lining up rifles and pistols in phantom rows in front of crumbling barricades. Others, with brusque gestures, threw their machine guns into shapeless piles growing beside flooded trenches. But whether silent or cursing under their breath, all wore the same angry, helpless grimace. Weidling's surrender hastened the end of the fighting and at the same time marked the end of a chaotic defense. While he was negotiating deep in the Führerbunker, generals such as Wilhelm Burgdorf, head of the High Command, swallowed a cyanide capsule with his colleague Hans Krebs. Their bodies, discovered on the 2nd of May by Soviet troops, lay in a room adjacent to Hitler's office, alongside empty bottles of French cognac and piles of partially burned documents. While some generals chose death in the face of such a stark prospect, others embodied the ideological ferocity of the Nazi regime to the very end. Ferdinand Schörner, promoted to Army Commander-in-Chief by Hitler on 30 April 1945, the same day as the Führer's suicide, became a symbol of the fanatical obstinacy that dominated the final days of the Third Reich. Known for his ruthless tactics, Schörner deployed mobile military tribunals on the streets of Berlin and Bohemia to summarily execute soldiers accused of desertion. According to Wehrmacht records, between April and May 1945, he ordered the execution of at least 200 men, some of whom were hanged on poles with signs reading, "I am a coward." While issuing these orders from his headquarters in the Bavarian Alps, an isolated enclave linked by encrypted radio, Schörner insisted on transmitting counterattacks to already disbanded units, such as the 9th Panzer Division, destroyed outside Vienna on the 13th of April, or the 12th Army Corps, whose remnants had surrendered in Prague on the 11th of May. Following the capitulation on 8th May 1945, Schörner abandoned his troops in Austria, disguised in a private's uniform without insignia. He attempted to escape into the Alps, but was captured on 18 May by NKVD patrols near Mittenwald. Identified by seized documents, his arrest was recorded in a classified Soviet report which noted his arrogant attitude during interrogation. Transferred to Moscow, Schörner spent a decade in prison camps and was tried in 1952 by a Soviet military tribunal. Among the charges was the execution of Czech civilians during the German retreat in 1945, crimes he justified to the NKVD as necessary to maintain discipline. He never showed any remorse. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but released in 1955 during a prisoner exchange between the USSR and West Germany, dying in Munich in 1973. The capture of senior officers was not limited to figures such as Schörner, whose notoriety made them trophies for the Soviet Union. Between March and May 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, generals such as Walter von Seydlitz, chairman of the anti-Nazi German Officers' League, surrendered on the Eastern Front, hoping for clemency. Others, however, such as General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, were detained in their homes by specialist NKVD teams. The methods varied. In Prague, General Rudolf Toussaint tried to negotiate his surrender in exchange for guarantees, but was arrested and taken to Moscow in handcuffs. In Breslau, General Hermann Niehoff ordered his troops to hold out until 6th May, when he was captured while trying to flee disguised as a farmer. These stories, although diverse, shared a common denominator: the end of Nazi authority and the absolute control of the victors. But if there was one case that epitomized the brutality of collapse and the ambiguity of surrender, it was that of SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke. In the final days of April 1945, as Berlin disintegrated under Soviet fire, Wilhelm Mohnke led a fierce and desperate resistance from the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Commanding Kampfgruppe Mohnke, an amalgam of 2,000 SS men, veterans of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and teenagers of the Volkssturm, he turned every street between the Reichstag and the Führerbunker into a death trap. Under his command, snipers posted in half-ruined buildings and panzer grenadiers armed with Panzerfausts delayed the advance of the Soviet Third Shock Army for 72 hours. Witnesses told Smersh officers of executions of deserters under Mohnke's command in Berlin, echoing earlier crimes by his units. In 1940, his men massacred 80 British prisoners at Wormhout. In Normandy, the 12th SS Panzer Division, in coordination with his division, shot 34 Canadians at Fontenay-le-Pesnel, and in the Ardennes, his subordinate Joachim Peiper led the Malmedy massacre. Following these acts, Mohnke attempted to evade responsibility by fleeing through the sewers on May 2, 1945, but was intercepted by a patrol of the Soviet 8th Guards Army. His capture was not anonymous. He wore a dog tag bearing his rank, and the Soviets, recognizing his value as a key witness, transported him to Tempelhof with unusual treatment for a war criminal. NKVD reports recorded that he ate schnitzel and potatoes while recounting tactical details of the defense of Berlin, but omitted any mention of the fate of Hitler's corpse. This calculated cooperation evaporated upon his arrival in Moscow on May 9th, where 6 years of solitary confinement in a windowless room, interrogations at 3 a.m., and frequent questions about his final minutes in the bunker awaited him in the cells of the Lubyanka. In 1951, while other Nazi generals were testifying at the Nuremberg trials, Mohnke was transferred to the Voikovo prison camp, a secret facility near Ivanovo, Russia. There, detainees classified as strategic assets for their military knowledge were forced to mine coal in extreme winter temperatures, dressed in canvas uniforms and fed minimal rations of flour soup and black bread. Among the high-profile prisoners, Mohnke survived until October 1955, when Konrad Adenauer negotiated his release as part of a bilateral agreement with the USSR. Back in West Germany, he worked as a trailer salesman until in 1979, declassified Canadian intelligence files linked him to crimes in Normandy, including the Fontenay-le-Pesnel massacre. Although Bonn authorities reopened the case, it was closed in 1980 for lack of conclusive evidence. Mohnke died in 2001 at the age of 90, without facing trial, as did numerous former SS members whose responsibility for war crimes could not be proven in court. Soviet interrogations and torture. Mohnke's case was no exception. Like him, hundreds of SS and Wehrmacht officers were subjected to immediate interrogations, in which Smersh sought to extract crucial information about the inner workings of the Nazi regime. These began immediately, prioritizing the extraction of tactical information, such as unit locations and counterattack plans. Witnesses recounted that generals such as Friedrich Paulus, captured at Stalingrad in 1943, were forced to confront their subordinates in taped sessions. These confrontations sought to fracture Nazi hierarchical loyalty. The recordings were used to discredit leaders in the eyes of their troops and to extract cross-confessions, as happened in 1944 with General Walter von Seydlitz, whose statement against Hitler was broadcast over loudspeakers on the Eastern Front. It was not uncommon for prisoners to be subjected to sleep deprivation or mock executions. An emblematic case was that of General Arthur Schmidt, who, after refusing to collaborate in May 1945, was locked in an underground cell in Lubyanka for 72 hours with spotlights on day and night. By July 1945, dozens of generals were already in prison camps like Krasnogorsk, where they shared barracks with privates, a psychological blow calculated to erase their status. This strategy of confinement was part of a broader picture of the treatment of captured officers. Historical records indicate that the capture of Nazi officers was not a uniform process. Some generals, aware of the inevitability of their capture, surrendered voluntarily, while others attempted suicide to avoid trial and public humiliation. Once captured, high-ranking officers were taken to temporary detention centers before being sent to prisoner-of-war camps in the Soviet Union. Conditions in these camps were extremely harsh, characterized by overcrowding, food shortages, and forced labor. Although the Soviet authorities justified these measures as a form of retributive justice, the reality was that many of the prisoners did not survive the hardships of their captivity. However, while most suffered extreme conditions, some generals met a different fate. Those who were considered especially valuable for their military knowledge or political influence could receive somewhat less harsh treatment, being used as sources of information or as tools in Soviet propaganda. The fate of Nazi commanders in concentration camps. As the Red Army secured control over previously Nazi-occupied territories, the capture of SS officers and soldiers was not the only Soviet objective. Among the most sought-after generals were concentration camp commanders, who were directly responsible for the atrocities that defined the horror of the Third Reich. To the Soviets, these individuals symbolized both the horror unleashed upon Europe and the suffering their nation had endured between 1941 and 1944. Operation Barbarossa left its mark on Soviet territory. As the Nazis swept across vast areas of Soviet territory, entire cities such as Kharkiv and Stalingrad were destroyed, reducing them to rubble and ash. The NKVD troops tasked with identifying and arresting these officers operated under clear orders. No one responsible for the atrocities committed in the occupied territories was to go unpunished. In this context, summary trials and executions became the immediate fate of many of these commanders. Figures such as Anton Thumann, who was responsible for the administration of Majdanek, were arrested in the months following the fall of Berlin and subjected to expeditious trials in cities such as Kyiv and Lviv. Thumann, known for his sadism and direct involvement in mass murder, was one of the most infamous names among those captured. From mid-February 1943 to March 1944, he served as head of the pre-trial detention camp at Majdanek, a position that allowed him to directly implement policies of extermination and forced labor. Under his supervision, prisoner selections were carried out with methodical cruelty, resulting in the systematic execution of thousands of detainees, mostly Jews. According to eyewitness Jerzy Kwiatkowski, who was interned at Majdanek from March 1943 to July 1944, Thumann personally executed Soviet prisoners of war, displaying a brutality that was evident in his every act. He owned a German shepherd that he used to bite inmates, exacerbating the prisoners' suffering and terror. This behavior was a constant in the extermination regime prevailing at Majdanek, where executions and forced labor were the inevitable fate of most detainees. Thumann, like other captured officers, was tried for his direct involvement in acts of extermination and forced labor. The death sentences that followed these trials were carried out publicly, reflecting the Soviets' intention to set a clear precedent in the treatment of Nazi war criminals. At these trials, the evidence presented included testimony from survivors and documents found in the camps themselves, which made it possible to accurately delineate the scale of the crimes committed. The executions, mostly carried out by firing squad, were witnessed by a small number of people, usually Soviet soldiers and prisoners of war, as part of a process of humiliation and exemplification. On the outskirts of Berlin, between the cracked walls and twisted barbed wire of what was once the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a new phase of its dark existence began in August 1945. Conceived by the Nazis as a concentration camp and training center for SS officers, the site was converted by the Soviets into the special NKVD-7 camp, a facility intended for the confinement of enemies of the new order. The watchtowers, previously guarded by the SS, were now occupied by Russian soldiers. This pattern of repression was not limited to Germany. In the occupied territories of Ukraine, where camps such as Janovska had served as killing centers, the Soviets undertook meticulous documentation of crimes. Soviet efforts to record Nazi atrocities extended to several liberated regions, including the occupied territories of Ukraine following the fall of the Third Reich. NKVD teams collected photographs of gas chambers, plans for crematoria, and testimonies from survivors, evidence that was later presented at trials in the region. At Majdanek, troops discovered mass graves containing the remains of thousands of victims, mostly Jews but also Soviet prisoners of war captured during Operation Barbarossa. Documentation of these crimes served as the basis for trials that took place in cities such as Kyiv, Minsk, and Kharkiv. These trials sought to punish the guilty and, at the same time, reassert Soviet control over the newly liberated territories. The sentences, broadcast on radio and in the press, served as a warning. The USSR would not tolerate resistance, past or present, or the Soviet exploitation of Nazi technicians and generals. The Soviet Union, following the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945, pursued both war criminals and Nazi generals and technicians whose knowledge could be exploited, while Western powers initiated operations such as Paperclip, a US-led program that recruited German Nazi scientists, technicians and officers to work on military and technological projects to benefit the Cold War. Moscow did the same, implementing its own strategy of forced recruitment. In the early hours of 22nd October 1946, NKVD agents arrested more than 2,500 German scientists, engineers and generals in a coordinated operation code-named Osoaviakim. They were taken in sealed trains to secret facilities where their skills were incorporated into strategic projects. Prominent among those arrested was Helmut Grötrup, a rocket engineer who had refused to join Werner von Braun and other specialists in working for the United States. Instead, he decided to remain in the Soviet occupation zone, where in September 1945 he began work on rebuilding V-2 rockets as head of the Grottrup office in Blecherode, Thuringia. In 1946 he was appointed director of the Nordhausen Institute and the Zentralwerke, which employed thousands of people in rocket manufacturing. During this time, Grottrup and his team helped the Soviets develop a replica of the V-2, known as the R-1 missile, which was completed in 1950. From 1946 to 1950, Grottrup led a team of over 170 German scientists in Moscow under the supervision of Soviet chief designer Sergei Korolev, contributing significantly to missile development and the early advances of the Soviet space program. However, from 1950 onwards, Grottrup was replaced due to his refusal to pursue other Soviet projects. Despite his departure, the German team continued to work under the supervision of other scientists, such as Johannes Hoch and Waldemar Wolf. Although his efforts were limited to internal projects, his influence on missile construction and the launching of the first Soviet space launches was enduring. Advances in Soviet missile technology in the mid-1950s, in particular the R-7 missile, which would be used to launch Sputnik 1 in 1957, were a direct result of these contributions. The legacy of Nazi generals and other prominent figures who worked for the Soviet Union has been marked by controversy. Their involvement in the development of the Soviet arms and space race was largely ignored or downplayed during the Cold War, often to avoid acknowledging the transfer of knowledge from a Nazi to a communist regime. However, in the USSR, their contributions were recognized as fundamental to the early success of the space program. The technologies and ideas that these men with ties to the Nazi regime helped develop were adapted and repurposed to strengthen the communist government. Instruments of propaganda and reprisals. The capture of the German generals at the end of World War II represented a strategic opportunity for the Soviet Union. Beyond their value as prisoners of war, these Nazi officers became key elements of Soviet propaganda, being used to build a narrative that discredited the Third Reich and favored the interests of the communist regime. In this context, Friedrich Paulus emerged as one of the most relevant examples. After his capture in Stalingrad on 31 January 1943, his figure was transformed from that of a high-ranking Nazi commander to an essential piece in the ideological confrontation that marked the post-war period. Days before his surrender on 30 January 1943, Paulus had been promoted to Field Marshal by Adolf Hitler in a tactic that sought to dissuade him from surrendering, because no German Field Marshal had lost to Germany's enemies until then, and for the German people that news would represent a devastating blow, especially for Hitler's troops. The collapse at Stalingrad was a devastating blow to German morale. After his capture, the Soviets documented the moment by photographing wounded, filthy, defeated German soldiers, photographs that were used extensively as propaganda to highlight the Soviet triumph. During his captivity, Paulus was not only persuaded to contribute to radio messages urging German soldiers to surrender, but his role took on an even more symbolic dimension. In a remarkable turn, the Marshal served as a witness at the Nuremberg trials, where he denounced his former superiors. This process of re-education and propaganda, initiated during his imprisonment, sought to discredit the German military high command and to consolidate the extent of the Soviet victory before the world. Despite this, Paulus's figure created divisions among Germans themselves. While the Allies held him up as a symbol of repentance, many compatriots considered him a traitor, demonstrating the lasting impact of these strategies on the perception of German military prestige. The public degradation of captured generals became another central plank of Soviet reprisals. In May 1945, days after the German surrender, several high-ranking officers were forced to march in public parades, exposed to the scorn and ridicule of crowds. Such public humiliations were part of a broader strategy aimed at the dual purpose of punishing individuals and systematically eroding the legacy of the German military as a whole. Among the most extreme actions carried out by the Soviets were summary executions and disappearances of some captured generals. In the months immediately following the end of the war, several high-ranking officers were tried and executed without formal judicial proceedings. These acts, while in some cases responding to the logic of obtaining immediate retaliation, also reflected distrust and the desire to eliminate possible symbols of resistance, or figures who could re-articulate a narrative opposed to that of the victors, that is, to communist ideology. The cruelty of the Allies. Although the Soviet authorities meted out ruthless treatment to the generals and high-ranking officers of the Third Reich, the Western Allies were equally firm in judging those who, according to their own defense, were merely following orders. As a soldier, it was my duty to follow the directives of the state. Was I expected to disobey my supreme commander? These were the words of Alfred Jodl, General-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht's operations staff during its defense at Nuremberg in 1946. The operational architect of the invasion of Poland, Jodl signed orders that unleashed atrocities from the first day of the war. Under his supervision, the Luftwaffe bombed defenseless towns like Wielun, where 1,200 civilians died in a matter of hours on September 1st. Later, as Hitler's right-hand man in the High Command, he drafted the Kommandobefehl, which called for the execution without trial of captured Allied commandos, even in uniform, in violation of the Geneva Conventions. He also endorsed the mass deportation of civilians from Eastern Europe for slave labor in German factories, a system that fueled extermination by exhaustion. His defense, centered on military loyalty, collapsed when it was shown that he not only carried out orders, but designed strategies that normalized barbarism. The court found him guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and conspiracy. On the 16th of October 1946, Alfred Jodl was hanged. The difference with the First World War was abysmal. After that conflict, defeated German generals were granted leniency, and their responsibilities were diluted in the ambiguous clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. However, the end of the Second World War marked a radical turning point. In 1945, as German defeat loomed, the Allies quickly put in place an unprecedented legal mechanism, the Nuremberg trials. This historic event forever transformed the treatment of defeated military leaders, drawing an unprecedented line between justice and retribution. The Nuremberg trials, held between 20 November 1945 and 1 October 1946, marked the fate of numerous Nazi leaders who until then were considered untouchable due to their high ranks. Among the accused was Wilhelm Keitel, head of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, whose defense centered on the argument that he was only following Hitler's orders, which was rejected by the court. Keitel was sentenced to hanging on the 16th of October 1946 along with Alfred Jodl, head of operations of the High Command, for their participation in the planning of invasions such as that of Poland in 1939, which triggered World War II, and the invasion of France in 1940, in addition to their role in the occupation of territories such as Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Soviet Union. Keitel was denied his last wish to be shot as a soldier rather than hanged. It was all bad news, and it did not end there, for the American executioner John C. Woods miscalculated the length of the ropes, which prevented instant death by cervical fracture. Instead, Keitel suffered prolonged agony from asphyxiation. The executions of these generals represented an act of justice for the victors and set a clear precedent. Obeying orders would not be enough to evade responsibility for such heinous crimes. However, not all Nazi leaders faced Allied justice at Nuremberg. Some escaped, took their own lives, or were tried in subsequent trials. Unlike the Soviet approach, which tended towards summary trials and immediate executions, the Western Allies sought at Nuremberg a more structured, though no less ruthless, judicial procedure. Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister of the Third Reich from 1938, was a key player in the Nazi diplomatic machinery. He signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939, with the USSR, which not only divided Poland but also facilitated its invasion and the subsequent mass deportation of Polish Jews to ghettos. His office actively collaborated with the SS. In 1942, he authorized German ambassadors in occupied countries to coordinate the final solution, legitimizing deportations to extermination camps such as Auschwitz. In addition, he negotiated alliances with fascist regimes such as Mussolini's Italy and Imperial Japan, broadening the theater of the war. At Nuremberg, his role in crimes against humanity was exposed, from the systematic plundering of resources in occupied territories to the handing over of French and Dutch Jewish citizens to the SS. Although he attempted to justify himself by claiming ignorance of the Holocaust, his own written orders, such as the September 1942 directive to cleanse Western Europe of Jews, linked him directly to the genocide. The court found him guilty on all counts, and he was hanged on October 16, 1946. Alongside Ribbentrop, Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, faced the same fate. While Ribbentrop forged international alliances for the Reich, Frank carried out a reign of terror on Polish soil. He closed universities, executed intellectuals, and oversaw the expropriation of land for German settlers. Under his rule, 4 million Poles were displaced or sent to forced labor, and the Jewish ghettos of Warsaw and Łódź became a direct route to the gas chambers. Frank was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Before his execution, he admitted, "1,000 years will pass, and Germany's guilt will not be erased." His downfall, along with that of Ribbentrop, symbolized the collapse of a system where diplomacy and barbarism had been two sides of the same coin. The scope of the crimes for which they were tried and convicted made no distinction between the political and the military, making it clear that the Nazi system had been dismantled to be judged in its entirety. However, not all of the defendants faced capital punishment. Some, such as Rudolf Hess, received life sentences. Hess, who had been one of Hitler's closest associates and his vice-chancellor, shocked the world in 1941 when, in an isolated and unexpected act, he flew to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom. This attempt failed miserably, and he was arrested upon arrival. His mission was found to lack official authorization from Hitler. Betrayal and disconnection with the Nazi regime led to Hess being considered a marginal figure within the Third Reich, despite his high rank in the party. During the Nuremberg trials, his defense focused on his alleged mental health, claiming that his actions in 1941 were due to a psychological breakdown. However, the court did not give credence to this excuse and found him guilty of conspiracy for peace, for which he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite his conviction, Hess spent the rest of his days incarcerated in Spandau prison in Berlin, where he died in 1987 under mysterious circumstances, which still fuel conspiracy theories. Unlike the Soviet treatment, which generally showed no mercy to any guilty party, sending them all to the gulags to perform slave labor and dying in abject poverty, the Western Allies applied an approach that, although harsh, retained certain elements of judicial procedure. However, the punishments varied depending on the nature of the crime and the position of the accused within the Nazi regime, as reflected in the sentences handed down during the Nuremberg trials. The long twilight of the SS. Following years of captivity in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps, the fate of SS members captured in 1945 began to change markedly towards the end of the 1940s. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 marked a turning point in this process. With the advent of the de-Stalinization period led by Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet approach to prisoners of war, including SS soldiers and generals, became more flexible. This change, influenced both by the onset of the Cold War and by the need to mend internal and external tensions, resulted in the progressive release of thousands of prisoners between 1949 and 1956. During this period, controlled waves of repatriation occurred, documented in official records reflecting increasing rates of release. However, these releases were not without restrictions. The released prisoners faced lengthy interrogations and selection processes to determine their degree of involvement in the crimes of the Nazi regime. Many returned home in deteriorated physical and psychological conditions, marked by years of slave labor and illnesses acquired during their captivity. Conditions in Soviet prison camps had been brutally harsh. Members of the SS, held directly responsible for the crimes of the Third Reich, were treated particularly harshly. Mortality rates reached alarming levels during the first years of captivity, exacerbated by the extreme climate, food shortages, and the grueling nature of forced labor in rebuilding Soviet infrastructure. Historical records mention diseases such as typhus and dysentery, which claimed thousands of lives in a period when the Soviet priority was not the preservation of inmates, but the exploitation of their labor force. Despite this, a considerable number of prisoners managed to survive these conditions, later testifying about the horrors experienced in the camps. Meanwhile, not all SS members accepted the fate that awaited them when they fell into Soviet hands. During the final months of the war, as the collapse of the Third Reich loomed, many of them engaged in desperate strategies to avoid capture. Some chose to blend in with the civilian population, burning their uniforms and destroying any documents that identified them as SS members. Others attempted to escape to areas controlled by Western Allied forces, believing that their treatment would be less severe. These strategies, though risky, proved effective for a segment of the hunted Nazi generals who managed to elude immediate capture. Underground networks helped former SS members escape to South America, the Middle East, and even the United States. In some cases, these networks relied on the collaboration of religious figures and sympathizers who, for various reasons, sought to protect the fugitives. For those who managed to escape or avoid capture, the specter of international justice remained looming. From the Nuremberg trials to the subsequent investigations carried out in the 1950s and 1960s, efforts to identify and prosecute war criminals continued. Some SS members who had managed to blend in with the civilian population were eventually discovered, extradited, and tried. Testimonies from concentration camp survivors and documents collected during the war played a crucial role in these investigations, exposing the crimes these men tried to conceal. The impact of these late releases and captures also influenced the reconstruction of Germany. In the Soviet-controlled German Democratic Republic, the official narrative about the released prisoners aligned with the ideological interests of the regime, presenting them as rehabilitated and reintegrated into socialist society. In contrast, in the Federal Republic of Germany, many of those released faced difficulties in fully reintegrating due to the stigma attached to their past and the physical and emotional scars they carried with them. The releases also had a symbolic impact, representing a step towards the normalization of international relations in a period marked by tension between opposing blocs. The fate of the captured German generals, from their prolonged captivity in Soviet camps to their release, played a key role in the political and social changes that followed World War II. The decision on their treatment, taken by the victorious powers, determined not only the prisoners' future, but also the dynamics that would mark the reconfiguration of Europe. As the Western and Soviet blocs began to consolidate, the treatment of these generals became a symbol of new international tensions, shaping the division that would define the Cold War.